January 1944. Over the vast Pacific, a Japanese reconnaissance pilot stares down from the thin air above the Mariana Islands. Far below, the ocean glints with steel. A convoy of American carriers steams eastward, their decks bristling with aircraft, each marked with the white star of the United States. He counts the planes, then counts again. There are too many. Back in Tokyo, intelligence officers spread the photographs across a long table. The images show something that should have been impossible. Squadrons of new aircraft, appearing faster than they could be shot down. The reports from the front say the same thing. Fresh fighters, bombers, transports, all arriving in endless waves. The numbers don't add up. America lost hundreds of planes in 1943, yet their air strength had doubled. Somewhere across the ocean, the Americans had found a way to build machines of war as easily as toys. In the conference rooms of the Imperial Japanese Navy, disbelief turns to dread. The enemy's greatest weapon, they realize, may not be a plane or a bomb, but the factory. And in Detroit, Seattle, and California, the engines of that weapon are already roaring to life. Before the first American bombers appeared over Tokyo, before the B-29's shadow fell across the Pacific, the real war had already begun, inside factories, foundries, and assembly halls. In the late 1930s, Japan stood as an industrial paradox. It possessed a modern navy, advanced aircraft, and disciplined engineers. Yet beneath the polished surface lay fragile foundations. The empire's industry was narrow, built on limited natural resources and overstrained shipyards. Its economy was designed for precision, not scale. Across the Pacific, the United States was the opposite. It was a giant asleep. In 1939, American factories were still producing cars, refrigerators, and typewriters. Boeing's aircraft output barely reached a few hundred planes a year. Yet the potential energy was staggering. Thousands of plants, millions of skilled workers, and an industrial network that spanned an entire continent. Then came war. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor shattered isolationism. The following morning, the United States awoke to the sound of its own transformation. Factories that once built sedans and farm tractors began stripping their lines to produce wings, fuselages, and engines. President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress and promised to turn the nation into the arsenal of democracy. The phrase was not a metaphor. It was a command. Within weeks, America's industrial leaders were summoned to Washington. Henry Ford, William Knudsen, and Donald Nelson, titans of the automotive world, were tasked with something no nation had attempted: to convert a consumer economy into a war machine overnight. Knudsen, a Danish-born executive from General Motors, understood the scale instantly. "Gentlemen," he said in his calm, clipped accent, "you can't fight a modern war with old production." Factories were not just retooled, they were reinvented. Conveyor belts, once moving car chassis, now carried bomber frames. Automobile presses stamped out parts for tanks. Tool and die makers became weapons engineers. By the end of 1942, assembly lines were humming 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This transformation was not smooth. Early efforts were chaotic. Contracts overlapped, materials ran short, and inexperienced laborers needed training. Yet every week the numbers rose. The War Production Board, led by Nelson, coordinated a national mobilization unseen in history. Cities like Detroit became the heart of a new kind of warfare, industrial warfare. While Japanese naval strategists envisioned battles of fleet against fleet, America was quietly waging a war of logistics and output. The idea was brutally simple: to build faster than the enemy could destroy. In 1940, the United States had produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. By 1943, that number had soared beyond 85,000. Every minute of every day, somewhere in America, a new aircraft engine was being built. This exponential surge stunned even U.S. officers. At Wright Field, procurement officers joked that the only thing faster than an American fighter was the rate at which Detroit could build another one. Meanwhile, in Japan, planners struggled to grasp the scale. Their aircraft industry, though technically skilled, was still handcrafted, reliant on artisan labor and limited aluminum supplies imported from distant colonies. Each Zero fighter was a work of precision and care, but the production line could not keep up. By 1943, Japan had produced roughly 16,000 aircraft. Impressive, yet dwarfed by America's output nearly six-fold greater. For Tokyo's military planners, it was more than a numerical problem. It was a philosophical one. They had prepared for a war of spirit and courage. America was preparing for a war of machines. And in the smoke of Detroit's forges and the glare of California's hangars, the arsenal of democracy was beginning to hum with unstoppable rhythm, the sound of a nation learning to build for victory. By mid-1942, the rhythm of American industry had become the heartbeat of the war. From the Great Lakes to the Pacific Coast, entire cities turned into extensions of the battlefield. In Michigan, Ford's Willow Run Plant emerged from the frozen farmland like a metallic city. Its walls stretched for more than a mile. Overhead, the air hung thick with the clang of steel and the hum of conveyor belts. On its polished floors, men and women in overalls assembled the B-24 Liberator, the largest production bomber project in history. Ford engineers had designed the plant as if it were building cars, not aircraft. Each bomber moved steadily down an assembly line that wound through hangar-sized bays. At peak efficiency, Willow Run produced one fully completed B-24 every 63 minutes. In Seattle, the Boeing company expanded from a regional aircraft maker into the beating heart of America's bomber force. Wooden hangars grew into aluminum cathedrals. By 1943, the city's skyline shimmered with new factories. Seattle's docks filled with crates of wings, fuselages, and engines bound for the Aleutians. Australia and beyond, farther south in California, Douglas and Lockheed transformed the Los Angeles basin into a maze of machine noise and exhaust. The dry air filled with the sharp scent of lubricants and metal dust. In these plants, women in coveralls replaced men who had gone to the front. They riveted, welded, tested engines, learning trades that had been closed to them only a few years earlier. This was the silent army Roosevelt had spoken of. Millions of civilians, organized with the precision of a military campaign. At its height, American industry employed over 16 million workers in defense production. Families measured time not by seasons, but by shifts. While the United States expanded its industrial base outward, Japan struggled inward. The empire's factories, already strained by years of conflict in China, faced shortages of aluminum, oil, and rubber. Merchant shipping, the veins of Japan's industrial body, was being severed by American submarines. Every loss of a cargo ship meant fewer materials for aircraft, tanks, and engines. Unlike America's vast mainland, Japan's geography offered no depth for dispersal. Industrial centers in Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokosuka operated under constant pressure, their output constrained by lack of raw material and constant Allied bombing. The Japanese military structure itself compounded the problem. Rivalries between the Army and Navy led to duplication and secrecy. Each service built its own aircraft designs, maintained separate procurement systems, and competed for the same limited resources. In contrast, the United States practiced integration. The War Production Board and the Office of War Mobilization forced coordination between companies that had once been competitors. General Motors built aircraft engines. Packard produced Rolls-Royce-designed Merlins for the P-51 Mustang. Chrysler manufactured tank components. To an American engineer, efficiency was patriotism. To a Japanese planner, efficiency was an unattainable dream. In 1943, when Japanese naval officers received intelligence on Ford's Willow Run, they dismissed the reported figures as Allied propaganda. The idea of producing a heavy bomber every hour seemed absurd, until reconnaissance confirmed it. Photographs showed vast complexes with rail lines, power stations, and storage yards covering acres of land. What Japan's finest plants achieved in a month, America's factories accomplished in a day. The contrast between the two nations was more than material. It was cultural. Japan's industrial philosophy prized craftsmanship and perfection. America's prized volume and velocity. Each approach reflected its society, but in total war, scale was decisive. By the end of 1943, The American mainland had become an industrial continent, while Japan's empire was already stretched thin. The stage was set for an imbalance so great that Japan's commanders could scarcely comprehend it. And as the machines rolled out, by the hundreds each day, they carried with them a message written in steel. The war would now be fought by production as much as by men. The factories were the new front lines, and the workers were its soldiers. In cities like Detroit, Seattle, and Burbank, men and women poured into assembly halls before dawn. The air smelled of oil and hot steel. Steam rose from the machines. Radios played war bulletins over the constant rhythm of hammers and riveting guns. America's working class had become its air corps. Housewives, clerks, and farmhands traded their daily routines for the grind of shift work. By 1943, women made up more than a third of the wartime labor force, nearly 7 million workers. They operated drill presses, inspected bomber fuselages, and crawled into narrow airframes to seal fuel lines. The image of Rosie the Riveter was no propaganda fantasy. It was a reflection of millions of real faces behind protective goggles and grease-streaked gloves. At the Douglas plant in Long Beach, shifts of women labored day and night to produce C-47 transports that would ferry paratroopers over Normandy. In Michigan, wives of auto workers now built the same machines their husbands flew. Their hands forged the wings of the American war machine. They earned less than men, often faced dangerous conditions, yet they worked with an urgency born of purpose. Letters from soldiers overseas hung on factory bulletin boards, reminders that every rivet, every bolt, might carry someone home alive. For many, this was the first taste of equality, of independence. The factory gates opened a new world, one that would outlast the war itself. The genius of American industry was not in invention, but in replication. The concept of the moving assembly line, perfected decades earlier by Henry Ford, now found its ultimate expression in the mass production of war. Aircraft had once been crafted like works of art, slow, precise, dependent on skilled hands. The war erased that tradition. Engineers redesigned planes to be built, not just flown. The B-24 Liberator, for example, was re-engineered so that each part could be produced by separate subcontractors and fitted together without hand tuning. Every component had a number, every process a time limit. Riveting, welding, assembly, all synchronized in a flow that turned complexity into rhythm. At Willow Run, more than 40,000 workers kept the line moving day and night. Each shift saw the skeleton of one bomber take shape, while another rolled out of the hangar. Forklifts and cranes moved with clockwork precision. The roar of engines under test stands shook the concrete floors. Elsewhere, Boeing used advanced jigs and interchangeable parts to speed up bomber production. North American aviation streamlined its processes to churn out the P-51 Mustang, one of the war's most versatile fighters. At a rate once deemed impossible, technology and organization merged into something greater, industrial momentum. Once it began, it could not easily be stopped. This was America's secret weapon. Not a single machine or engine, but the method of building them. Behind the noise of the factories were men whose leadership equaled that of any general in the field. William S. Knudsen, a former Ford executive, became the architect of the wartime conversion. When Roosevelt called on him to mobilize industry, he left behind one of the most powerful corporate positions in America, unpaid, to serve as director of war production. He believed that victory depended not on government control, but on coordination. Knudsen brought together industrial giants and union leaders, enforcing cooperation through sheer authority and trust. "We are not fighting for contracts," he told executives. "We are fighting for time." Donald Nelson, as head of the War Production Board, turned policy into execution. Under his direction, production priorities were set with ruthless efficiency. Civilian manufacturing was stripped away. Every ounce of material went to the front. Their coordination mirrored the military chain of command. Ford, Boeing, Douglas, and General Motors acted as divisions in an industrial army. Their orders came not from Washington's politicians, but from the battlefield's demands. More planes for Guadalcanal, more tanks for North Africa, more landing craft for Normandy. Meanwhile, Henry Kaiser, a shipbuilder with no previous naval experience, applied the same industrial logic to shipyards. His Liberty ships, mass-produced like automobiles, carried the materials of war across the oceans faster than enemy submarines could sink them. The leadership of American industry became a war story in itself. One fought not with rifles, but with blueprints, schedules, and resolve. And as the gears of production turned faster, a new kind of warfare emerged, one Japan could neither match nor fully comprehend. In Tokyo, reports from intelligence units arrived with increasing urgency. Reconnaissance flights over Pearl Harbor, Midway, and the Solomon Islands told a grim story. American aircraft were multiplying faster than expected. What Japanese planners once believed would be a short, decisive war was becoming a struggle against mathematics. Japan's industrial foundation could not sustain the empire's ambitions. The home islands possessed limited access to key materials. Aluminum, oil, and steel had to be imported from distant colonies in Southeast Asia. Every ton that left the docks at Singapore or Rabaul risked destruction by American submarines lurking along the shipping lanes. Factories in Nagoya and Yokosuka operated under constant strain. Each Zero fighter required intricate hand-fitting of parts, crafted by master technicians who worked with skill, but not speed. Production was as much art as science, even as engineers improved designs, like the Nakajima Ki-84 or the Mitsubishi J2M. The bottleneck remained human craftsmanship. Meanwhile, Japan's bureaucratic rivalry divided effort. The Army and Navy maintained separate air forces, competing for the same materials and engineers. In 1943, the Imperial Army Air Service and the Imperial Navy Air Service each issued their own engine specifications, each demanding priority. Cooperation was rare. Efficiency suffered. The result was tragic predictability. For every new Japanese aircraft that took flight, the United States rolled out 5. When American intelligence revealed that Japan's total aircraft production for 1943 was roughly 16,000 planes, U.S. officers in Washington were astonished, not at the number itself, but that it remained so small despite the empire's vast reach. By contrast, U.S. factories produced more than 5 times that figure, with better engines, more fuel, and endless replacement parts. By 1944, Japanese commanders began to understand. They were no longer fighting an army, but an economy. The American war economy was a marvel, but also a moral paradox. It demonstrated what industrial democracy could achieve, yet it came at immense human cost. Workers lived by the rhythm of shifts. Accidents were common. Industrial fatigue became a silent epidemic. At Boeing's Seattle plant alone, medical teams treated thousands of injuries each month. Burns, crushed fingers, exhaustion. For many, the home front was no less dangerous than the battlefront. Rationing and shortages tested patience. Tires, sugar, gasoline, all redirected to the war effort. Families lived within the strict logic of total mobilization. But they endured it willingly, driven by the conviction that production itself was patriotic duty. In economic terms, the transformation was staggering. Between 1940 and 1945, U.S. industrial output more than doubled. War spending consumed nearly 40% of the nation's GDP. The American state and private enterprise became one organism, capitalism weaponized for survival. Japan faced a different reality. Its population tightened belts under rationing far more severe. Coal and oil shortages crippled industry. Civilians melted down cookware and railings for scrap metal. Hunger became widespread by 1944. While American workers bought war bonds and filled factories with music, Japanese laborers toiled in silence, their efforts crushed under the weight of diminishing returns. Factories were bombed, cities burned, and the supply chain disintegrated piece by piece. By the war's final year, Tokyo's leaders faced an unspoken truth. No courage or strategy could offset industrial collapse. In the summer of 1944, the Pacific balance tilted irreversibly. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japan launched nearly 400 aircraft to intercept the American invasion fleet. They expected attrition, not annihilation. What happened instead was a revelation of industrial disparity. American radar-guided fighters, Hellcats and Corsairs, tore through the Japanese formations. Pilots described the battle as a slaughter. Within hours, more than 300 Japanese planes were lost. American losses barely reached 30, but the true wound came later. In the debriefing rooms of Tokyo, reports from frontline commanders painted a picture too grim to deny. Pilots were flying outdated models against swarms of freshly built enemy aircraft. Replacement planes were scarce. Training programs had been shortened. Fuel was rationed. Admiral Soemu Toyota, chief of the combined fleet, studied the figures in silence. For every Japanese plane destroyed, America could build 20 more. The Empire had no answer for that equation. By late 1944, despair seeped into strategy. Kamikaze tactics emerged not from fanaticism alone, but from necessity. A desperate response to the realization that Japan could no longer replace what it lost. Factories lay in ruins. Materials were gone. To Japan's high command, the shock was total. The industrial war they thought they understood had transformed into something beyond imagination. A system that produced destruction faster than courage could resist it. In that moment, Japan's commanders stopped asking how America fought and began asking how it built. By 1943, the American war machine had reached its full thunderous stride. The same industrial rhythm that built the cars of the 1930s now built the bombers, fighters, and transports that ruled the skies of the 1940s. It was no longer a question of superiority. It was a question of saturation. That year alone, U.S. factories produced nearly 96,000 aircraft, an output greater than that of Germany and Japan combined. Hangars stretched across the plains like steel horizons. Freight trains loaded with crated wings and engines wound across the continent in endless columns. To Japanese intelligence officers, the figures arriving from their attachés in Switzerland and Stockholm were almost absurd. They reported that American factories were producing more than 8,000 aircraft every month. Tokyo's analysts dismissed it as exaggeration until the evidence began to appear over the Pacific. The Solomon Islands, once a battlefield of attrition, became an airfield showcase. Fresh squadrons of Hellcats and Avengers replaced losses within weeks. Pilots who had once fought for survival now flew with an abundance of machines, fuel, and ammunition. Each American carrier arrived fully replenished, its decks crowded with newly painted aircraft. Destroyers and oilers followed in endless lines, a logistical ballet that no other nation on Earth could perform. While Japanese air crews fought bravely, they faced an opponent that simply did not run out. The difference was not in tactics nor in skill. It was in arithmetic. In the spring of 1944, the equation came to life over the Central Pacific. The U.S. Navy, now backed by overwhelming industrial power, launched Operation Forager, the invasion of the Mariana Islands. The objective to seize Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, islands close enough for the new B-29 bombers to reach Japan itself. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the Fifth Fleet. Opposing him was Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, leading what remained of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force. Ozawa's fleet carried more than 400 aircraft, many flown by inexperienced pilots hastily trained to replace the veterans lost at Midway and the Solomons. On June 19, 1944, they met in what would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The battle began shortly before 10 a.m. as Japanese carriers launched their first wave. Radar aboard American ships detected the incoming formations more than 100 miles away. Hellcats from the carriers Lexington, Yorktown, and Hornets scrambled to intercept. What followed was not a contest. It was an industrial consequence. The U.S. Navy's air groups, trained through months of steady replenishment and practice, met the attackers with radar coordination, superior communication, and overwhelming numbers. Japanese aircraft, many outdated and poorly maintained, were cut down in waves. By the end of the day, nearly 300 Japanese planes were destroyed. American losses barely exceeded 30. The skies over the Marianas became the final proof of what mass production could do. Each Hellcat lost could be replaced in days. Each Japanese Zero destroyed represented months of work, scarce materials, and a vanished pilot who could not easily be replaced. From the bridges of American carriers, officers watched the burning remnants of Japanese planes drift into the sea. They knew what it meant, not just a victory, but confirmation that Japan's industrial base had collapsed beyond recovery. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the irreversible turning point of the Pacific War. For Japan, it was the end of its offensive power. For the United States, it was the beginning of industrial dominance expressed in fire and steel. In Tokyo, radio intercepts described the devastation in clipped, emotionless terms. But among the senior staff of the Imperial Navy, shock spread like silence. Reports of aircraft losses arrived faster than replacement orders could be issued. Factories in Nagoya scrambled to increase output, but without oil, aluminum, or trained labor, it was hopeless. The empire's industrial bloodstream had been cut, and now, on the captured runways of Saipan, the next phase of the American machine prepared to unfold, the arrival of the B-29 Superfortress, a bomber born directly from Detroit's and Seattle's assembly lines. The Japanese High Command braced itself for what they already suspected, that their skies, too, would soon belong to American industry. By late 1944, the thunder that filled the skies above Japan no longer came from its own aircraft. It came from across the ocean, from the limitless output of America's assembly lines. From the moment Saipan and Tinian fell, the distance between American industry and the Japanese homeland effectively vanished. The B-29 Superfortress, a machine that embodied the peak of wartime engineering, carried the factory floor into the stratosphere. Built by Boeing with components from Glenn Martin and Bell Aircraft, it represented the combined muscle of a continent. Each B-29 required over 350,000 parts. Its Wright R-3350 engines were built in separate states and shipped by train to be fitted in final assembly. Workers across dozens of cities contributed to every bomber, a living map of national unity. In the fall of 1944, these aircraft began their long-range missions from the Marianas. Their target, the Japanese industrial heartland. When the first formations appeared over Tokyo in November, the Japanese people looked skyward in disbelief. The aircraft were flying higher and faster than their interceptors could reach. Anti-aircraft fire burst harmlessly beneath them. The air raid sirens wailed, not as warning but as acknowledgement of helplessness. Each wave of bombers was a visible expression of something far greater than technology. It was industrial inevitability, the logical conclusion of Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy. American production had reached its zenith, 300,000 aircraft built in just 3 years. Entire fleets of bombers and fighters rolled off the lines faster than the logistics officers could ship them. In Kansas, the Wichita Boeing plant produced 4 B-29s a day. At Lockheed's Burbank plant, workers assembled the sleek P-38 Lightning under vast camouflage netting, designed to look like a suburban neighborhood from the air. Japan could not match even a fraction of this scale. Its factories, still operating with limited power and manual tools, had become targets themselves. Every air raid meant another delay, another set of destroyed tools, another assembly hall lost. In early 1945, the raids intensified under the command of General Curtis LeMay. He stripped the bombers of defensive armament, loaded them with incendiaries, and ordered low-altitude night attacks. The result was devastation beyond anything yet seen. On the night of March 9, 1945, 279 B-29s departed from the Marianas. They flew over Tokyo in perfect formation, guided by radar, the sky glowing red beneath them. Within hours, nearly 16 square miles of the capital were burning. More than 100,000 civilians died, more than in Hiroshima or Nagasaki months later. From the perspective of Japan's high command, the horror had two faces: human loss and industrial annihilation. Tokyo's manufacturing districts, which had produced aircraft parts, engines, and precision tools, were gone. The remaining factories in Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe soon followed. Japan's aircraft output collapsed. By mid-1945, it produced barely a tenth of what America was building each month. Planes were assembled from scavenged metal. Fuel supplies were so low that pilots trained by gliding unpowered aircraft down hillsides. Admiral Toyota, in a meeting that June, received a production report showing fewer than 1,000 operational aircraft remaining across the entire home defense system. He studied the numbers, then set the paper down without speaking. The silence in the room said everything. American aircraft now dominated not only the skies but the oceans. Fleets of carriers, replenished from the endless output of the West Coast, advanced toward Okinawa. Every attack, every landing, every convoy was supported by waves of mass-produced planes. Hellcats, Avengers, Corsairs, Mustangs, each one a product of the same relentless machine. The psychological shock within Japan's military leadership deepened into despair. For years, they had believed that courage, discipline, and spirit could overcome material weakness. But as they watched the sky darken under the silhouettes of hundreds of bombers, they saw a new kind of warfare, one won not by valor, but by volume. Japan's war effort no longer fought battles. It endured them. By the summer of 1945, the empire's factories were silent, its engineers scattered, its industrial cities reduced to ash. The arsenal of democracy had proven its power, not merely to fight but to build victory itself. And yet, in that terrible imbalance lay a paradox that would shape the post-war world. The same system that destroyed Japan's industry would later help rebuild it. But for now, as smoke rose from Tokyo and Osaka, the war machine of Japan had come to its end, outbuilt, outproduced, and overwhelmed by the sheer momentum of American manufacturing. When the fires of 1945 faded, what remained of Japan was not a conquered nation, but a dismantled system. The war had not only burned its cities, it had erased the very foundation of its industrial identity. For American strategists studying post-war reports, the numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States had produced over 324,000 aircraft. Japan, by contrast, had built fewer than 76,000. In the final 6 months of the war, American factories turned out more planes than Japan had managed in the previous 3 years combined. It was not only aircraft. The imbalance extended to every corner of the war machine: ships, tanks, trucks, engines, munitions. By 1945, the United States was producing 1,800 naval vessels a year. Japan built fewer than 100. In steel, the lifeblood of modern war, the U.S. outproduced Japan 20-1. The reports arriving on General MacArthur's desk after the surrender painted a grim economic portrait. Entire manufacturing districts had vanished under the incendiary raids. Nagoya's aircraft works were 80% destroyed. Mitsubishi's engine plants in Osaka lay silent, their machine tools twisted and blackened. Even before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan's capacity to wage war had already collapsed. The atomic bombs were the final punctuation mark to an industrial defeat that had begun years earlier, on the assembly lines of America. Inside Japan's surviving factories, engineers walked through the wreckage of what had once been a proud industrial dream. Blueprints, half-burned, littered the floors. Precision tools lay in piles of ash. The silence inside those workshops was the echo of a nation's lost belief that spirit alone could overcome steel. When occupation forces arrived, they were astonished by the remnants. Japanese engineers, though exhausted and malnourished, had preserved meticulous production notes, hoping one day to rebuild. Among the ruins, they found prototypes: the advanced Shinden interceptor, jet engines under development, and partially assembled fighters that would never fly. The American analysts understood something profound. Japan had not lost because of lack of ingenuity. It had lost because its system could not multiply that ingenuity. Industrial historians later described it as defeat by scale. The U.S. had perfected distributed production, the art of dividing labor and standardizing components across thousands of suppliers. Japan's production remained centralized, vulnerable, and slow. At the time of surrender, fewer than 20% of Japan's pre-war machine tools were operational. Coal shipments had fallen by 70%. Aluminum production, once critical for the Zero fighter, had nearly ceased. In the final months, even bicycle parts were repurposed for weapons. When Emperor Hirohito's broadcast announced the end of the war on August 15, 1945, many Japanese officers wept, not only from defeat but from exhaustion. They had fought against a machine they could not understand. In Washington, U.S. War Department officials studied post-war reports with a mixture of triumph and unease. America had won the war not only through bravery, but through manufacturing capacity, unmatched in human history. The question was whether such power could ever be balanced again. And yet, amid the devastation, a strange new seed began to grow, one that would, in time, transform Japan from a defeated empire into a technological power. But in 1945, that future was unimaginable. For now, Japan was a nation of ashes and silence, its generals humbled, its factories cold, its people staring into the ruins of a war they could no longer fight or even supply. The arsenal of democracy had not merely defeated an enemy. It had proven that the age of industrial warfare had arrived, and that no nation could survive without mastering its rhythm. When the Allied occupation began in late 1945, Japan's remaining industry stood still. The smell of burnt metal and dust lingered over cities that had once been engines of empire. Yet within that silence, a new purpose began to stir. General Douglas MacArthur, now Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, understood the importance of reconstruction. His staff included economists and industrial planners who saw Japan not only as a defeated enemy, but as a potential partner in rebuilding Asia's economy. They realized that Japan's people possessed something powerful: discipline, technical skill, and an almost instinctive dedication to work. The U.S. occupation forces dismantled Japan's military industries, but they did not destroy its industrial knowledge. American experts instead studied it, and soon they began to teach. Manuals on production management, efficiency, and mass manufacturing were translated into Japanese. Engineers from Tokyo University and surviving companies like Mitsubishi and Nakajima, later Fuji Heavy Industries, were invited to learn from American specialist factories that had built bombers began producing sewing machines, bicycles, and radios. The infrastructure of war became the skeleton of peace. Many of the same assembly lines that once turned out engines for Zero fighters would, within a decade, produce the first wave of Japan's post-war consumer technology. It was a transformation rooted in humility and observation. Japanese engineers studied American industrial methods with fascination. They took notes on everything: conveyor systems, standardized parts, time-motion studies. They saw that victory had not come from raw resources alone, but from the discipline of efficiency. Among the most influential lessons came from W. Edwards Deming, an American statistician sent to Japan in 1950 to teach statistical quality control. His principles, precision through measurement, consistency through process, resonated deeply with Japanese engineers who had once prized craftsmanship above repetition. They learned to merge the two. Within a decade, Japan began its own industrial renaissance. Companies like Toyota and Sony adopted the mass production mindset that had once defeated them, refining it into something new, flexible, precise, and relentlessly efficient. The very methods that had overwhelmed their wartime industry became the foundation of their post-war success. The contrast was striking. In 1945, Japan's cities were dark and silent. By 1955, the hum of factories had returned. Not to build war machines, but to build the world's finest cameras, radios, and automobiles. The same ingenuity that had once crafted the Zero now crafted the transistor and the compact car. To historians, this evolution remains one of the most profound transformations in modern history. A nation that had fallen victim to industrial warfare became, in peace, its greatest student. The shock that Japanese commanders had felt in 1943, the disbelief that anyone could build airplanes like cars, became the spark for a new national philosophy: monozukuri, the art of making things with both efficiency and soul. The United States, too, learned from the experience. The wartime partnership between government and industry reshaped its own economy, leading to decades of technological dominance and global influence. Yet America's lesson was one of caution. the recognition that its industrial might had become both strength and responsibility. By the time the occupation ended in 1952, Japan had re-emerged as an industrial nation reborn, pacifist in constitution, yet unmatched in manufacturing ambition. The ruins of 1945 became the foundations of a future that would astonish the world. The war that had begun with factories turned to battlefields had ended with battlefields turned back into factories. And so, from the ashes of destruction rose a new understanding. The power to build could destroy, but it could also heal. The Second World War had revealed a truth older than empire and more enduring than ideology, that modern warfare was no longer decided solely by courage or command, but by capacity. Japan's commanders had entered the conflict believing that skill, precision, and spirit could overcome material disadvantage. They discovered instead that in the age of machines, it was rhythm, not rhetoric, that determined survival. The sound that haunted them was not the drone of bombers, but the pulse of factories half a world away. The steady hammer of a rivet gun in Detroit, the roll of a conveyor belt in Seattle, the hiss of molten steel in California. Those sounds formed the real battlefront, the industrial symphony that built the planes, ships, and engines that ultimately carried victory across the Pacific. America's triumph was not an accident of abundance. It was the organization of abundance, the translation of freedom into efficiency, and of creativity into system. A nation of inventors had become a nation of builders. For Japan, the war's lesson was devastating but transformative. The shock of defeat forced a reckoning with its own ideals of craftsmanship and isolation. In time, that reckoning produced something remarkable, a synthesis of precision and production that would, within a generation, make Japan the world's new industrial powerhouse. The story of factories building planes like cars is, ultimately, the story of humanity's dual genius, to create and to destroy. The same tools that produced instruments of war could later produce instruments of peace. The same hands that forged bombers could forge bridges. In the quiet decades that followed, the smoke cleared, and the machines were silenced. But the lesson remained. In the modern world, power is not simply what a nation can fight with, but what it can build. And in that race, the race to create, to outproduce, to shape the future with steel and will, history remembers not just who fired first, but who built longest.